In this lesson, we'll work on giving our particles a little bit more of a gaseous, sort of foggy appearance. Okay, so in our previous lesson, we set up our pyrocluster material as well as the pyrocluster environment. So with that, we now have the ability to give these particles a little bit more of a kind of a smoky appearance. Now, at the moment, these don't necessarily look the way that I want. Right now, these look really, really thick. So let's come in and start to make some adjustments. So we have this pyrocluster material that we set up in our previous lesson. Now let's come in and start to explore some of these attributes. So we're going to start over here with the globals. Now as we start to adjust these, keep in mind that some of the settings that I'm using and some of the settings that you're going to use, it's entirely dependent on your particular scene. So every scene is going to be a little bit different. Every result that you try to get is going to be a little bit different. So I'll try to provide you with just sort of a brief overview of some of these kind of major areas of this pyrocluster. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff here to talk about, so we're not going to be able to go incredibly in-depth into everything, but from here you should be able to get a pretty good idea of how to use this. So to start with, just to make this a little bit easier, I'll just double-click down here in my material manager, and let's start up here with the globals. So this is where we can sort of start to control the overall appearance of our volume material here. We do have a few settings that we can use. So down toward the bottom, again in this globals tab, you've got a few presets that if you wanted to create a certain look, this can sort of get you on the right track and sort of get you started. We also have the ability to control sort of the overall color of this. Now this is done with this color ramp. So let's say I come in here to this far white swatch, and let's maybe set this to a little bit more of a maroon color, just to give this a little bit different shape here. Now at the moment, it's a little bit difficult to see. Now what we can also start to do is come in and begin increasing or decreasing this density. So if I were to bring this up to something like 100, you can see now we start to get something that has much more of a solid appearance to it, something more like a really thick clouds. Now we can even take this density up higher if we want to. So you can see how that starts to give this much more of a solid appearance, and that combined with this color gradient starts to kind of almost provide some sort of built-in shading, sort of a nice way of faking shading and shadows in our materials or in our volume. I might come in here and just switch those around so that way sort of this interior part of it looks a little bit more deeply shaded. Now we also have the ability to have our particles sort of change their behavior over time. So now that's done through these age attributes. Again, that can be found in this age tab. So to get an idea of what we have here, if you don't necessarily want to render out your particles, one of the things that Cinema 4D has is in this Globals tab, we have this little preview window. Now this is really, really useful because with this, we can see what the particle will look like from birth all the way until death. So we can start to see how the patterns change, how the particles start to dissipate. Now that all assumes that we have these age effects turned on. Once I turn those off, you should see that now this bit of particles really just stays the same throughout time. Okay. So for now, just to make this a little bit easier to see, what I'll do is turn off these age effects. And again, we can start to come in here and adjust some of these different shading attributes here in the global color. Again, sort of a nice way of faking some of the effects of shadows and highlights within the volume itself. Now, within the age, we can also start to control distance. So as these particle chunks start to get a little closer or further away, we can have their appearance start to change. We also have the ability to have these particles influenced by any sort of illumination that we have. So if I turn that on, and I'll just close this out for now. I'll just go ahead and close this, and we'll just use my attribute manager over here. Okay, so now with this use illumination turned on, we have a couple of different options here in the mode. We have diffuse, ray angle, or bump. Now each one of these will give you a slightly different appearance. So ray angle starts to create a little bit more of a false shading here. Typically I like to use something like this diffuse. Now one of the things that you may notice is whenever I turn on this use illumination and have it set to diffuse, now whenever I render this, my particles really just sort of come out black. So keep in mind that anytime you use this illumination mode, we need to at least have some sort of a light source in our scene, not just the default light. So in my case, I actually don't have any lights in my scene. Again, this is all being illuminated by the default light. So just for demonstration purposes, I'll drop in just a simple point light. There we go. Now this Omni light's been dropped in, and now we can start to see some of the shading effects from our particles. Now, again, this is with the use illumination mode turned on. You'll notice that what we see here in the preview and what we see in our interactive render region really doesn't look at all similar. We have all these little puffs and patterns in here, but none of those can be seen in my render region. Now this is the importance of that pyrocluster volume tracer that we talked about in our previous lesson. So back in our volume tracer, the reason that we don't see any of those details here is because our world step size is still set up pretty high. Now if I were to take this and maybe knock that down to something like 10, now we should start to see a lot more of those details beginning to appear. Again, every situation is a little bit different. The higher the detail that we want, that means that we're going to take this world step size and continue to bring this lower until we find sort of that right mixture between a render that's going to come back relatively fast and has the amount of detail that we want. Okay, so lots and lots of things to explore here. Again, this can give you anything from the appearance of really thick clouds to, in my case, I want to get more of a very, very thin kind of a steam-like material. So what I'm going to do is take my world step size back up to about 50. Let's go back to my pyrocluster material. And again, for something that is going to be really, really kind of soft and not very thick, I'm going to take my density and really, really drop this down, maybe down to something like only 1%. There we go. I might just switch these two around so that way we get a little bit more of that white appearance in here. Now, let's come back to our illumination. In my case, with this being such a thin material, I might not really need to have the light sources influencing this. So what I might do is take my illumination and turn that off. Now, another thing that I can do, because I do want this to be such a thin, sort of fog-like material, what we can do is go into the shadows. If you're going to be using something that you want to be really, really thick, like a really thick smoke or thick clouds, you can maybe start to enable the shadows to cast, to receive, to have these particles cast shadows on themselves. Be aware, though, that all of these different attributes will start to really, really heavily slow down your renders. So sometimes as a way of just sort of speeding things up or just making sure that these aren't even calculated. Again, for something that's going to be really, really thin, I'll take this and maybe just turn all of these off. Now, again, with this being more of a steam-like material, with something like that, obviously, as these particles start to spill out and begin to enter the atmosphere, they're going to spread out and kind of start to dissipate. So I want to set up some age effects that can sort of reflect that. So in this Age tab, I'm going to turn on my Age effects. And here we can start to control things like the radius, maybe how small these particles start out, and how much of their final size they achieve once they reach the end of their age. So in my case, I'll take the radius, and maybe have these start off really nice and small. So that way they start out at a really tiny radius, as we can now start to see up here. And then as time goes on and those particles start to age, they'll get larger and larger and give me a little bit more of that spread out, sort of dissipating appearance. Now, as far as the overall size of these particles, we can start to change these inside of this Shape tab. So this is what's determining just how large these particles get to be once they reach the end of their lifespan. So back in the shape, they would achieve right now a maximum size of 100 centimeters. So I could make this larger or smaller if I chose to. Maybe if I took my radius down to only 10 centimeters, you can see now that these particles are actually small to the point where they almost can't even be seen. So maybe take that to 50 centimeters. There we go. Now you can see my particles are much, much smaller. In my case, I'll probably leave this pretty close to the default of 100 centimeters. I kind of like the overall appearance of that. Now, one of the things that is probably going to be the biggest contributor as far as the overall appearance of these particles is going to be found over here in the Noise tab. So this is where we can start to control the actual fractal pattern that's used to basically create this shape. So we have a few presets. We have the turbulence. We can also set this to maybe a gaseous preset. In this case, the result doesn't look just terribly different, but you do have a few here to choose from and at least kind of get you started on the right path. So in my case, I'll set this to maybe a gaseous fractal type. And here we can start to play with a lot of these different attributes. And a lot of these are really just sort of fun to play with and experiment with. How regular or irregular some of these particle shapes may be. We can start to control things like the amount of detail that can be found inside of these fractal patterns. So if we wanted to get some really, really refined noise patterns in here, we can start to bump up that detail. Down here, though, this is where we can really start to gain a really, really high level of control over the appearance. So things like gain, bias, the low threshold and high threshold. As we start to bring these down, this is where we can start to kind of choke some of these particles back a little bit as far as their appearance, or make them a little bit easier to see. So in my case, I might take this bias and maybe start to drop that down a little bit. That should really kind of choke these particles down, as you can start to see here. Now that's really starting to look a little bit more like a fog or a smoke in my case. Now we can start to see some of the little wispy patterns in here by just dropping this bias down. We can also start to take something like this low threshold and the high threshold. Now what this can start to do is, as we start to change these numbers, that can start to kind of give us a little bit more of kind of holes in the overall pattern here. Now a little bit can go a long ways, as you can see. I might take this gain and set that back to kind of its default value. There we go. So now you can start to see, again, something really, really light, really wispy in appearance. Just kind of a nice little foggy effect here. Now let's come back, and we have this pyro cluster assigned to the emitter that's on this aircraft. Let's go ahead and find the emitter that's on the fueling line. We'll take that pyro cluster and drag it onto that emitter as well. So now what we should start to see is, as I render that out, we should start to see some of these kind of smoky little foggy effects that are on all of these particles. There we go. And that is really what I'm going for in this case. So lots and lots of control that we have over not just the simulated behavior of our particles, but as you can see, a tremendous amount of control over the rendered appearance of our particles. Okay, so that will now bring us to the conclusion of this portion covering particles and dynamics inside of Cinema 4D. So with that, in our next section, we'll start to talk about some of the different lighting and rendering features that we have inside of this application.